also start by saying I'm not a data linkage expert, so everything I say can be taken and with a grain of salt, as it were. But no, there certainly will be things that I certainly don't know about data linkage research, and I think it's also important to understand that NMA really facilitates sort of ethics approval recognition. And I think so some of the things that I was asked to talk about, and I will talk about a few things about how ethics committees review a data linkage application. So we do have standard principles for operation, as Suzanne was saying, but I think we don't get too much into the autonomy of the HREC in reviewing projects. So just to sort of have a bit of a nuance there. But look, let me start by saying just to give you a quick overview. So the jurisdictions, I'll mention who's in the NMA data linkage scheme. Certainly Suzanne covered a bit of that with her presentation, but also just some of the application processes and particularly in terms of an HREC application and what they look for. And a couple of tips for researchers, I think, if we can. I'm going to put that. So who's in? Well, data linkage, as Suzanne mentioned, was initially it was an exemption from a couple of jurisdictions, but then we moved pretty swiftly to get everyone in. So anyone who had an exemption removed that, except for a couple of jurisdictions. It looks like half of Australia there, doesn't it? But that's just geographically. So New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, South Australia, ACT, and Tasmania. And a couple of nuances there as well, but Tasmania certainly will recognise the review. They don't have a participating HREC, but will we'll recognise the review of one of the participating data linkage HRECs. We'll get onto those in a minute too. Not quite yet. Northern Territory, just given the demographics of their population, require a separate review to assure cultural safety. Western Australia have sort of opted out. I mean, that sound too harsh, but they were going to come in, but then are not. And also, importantly, the Commonwealth. So the Commonwealth are not a party to NMA, although increasingly it does. There probably are some advantages for them to do that. So do need local HREC approval to be sought in those jurisdictions, and particularly for Commonwealth data, and that especially with the AIHW data set needs separate approval there too. So who are these data linkage HRECs that people need to go to? Well, there are a few in each jurisdiction. New South Wales, ACT, South Australia have their centrally established ethics committees. There are 4 in Queensland, and Victoria just overdosed on data linkage expertise there, and they've gone with about 7 committees who can review. So you can go any of those committees for your data linkage ethics approval. There are obviously a number of other components associated with data linkage research, just using the nature of it, but that's the ethics component that you need. So just in terms of, it's probably a good part to just sort of summarise where we are in the jurisdictions that we have put out a data linkage guide for NMA. This is the Victorian site, of course, data linkage studies down there, the click in the lower left-hand corner, but all NMA jurisdictions host the guide on their websites. It's got pretty much the information that I'll be telling you in this presentation, but also some more on the procedural things as well. So just in terms of how the NMA was established, and Suzanne went through that with the MOU, but certainly this change was made with the amendment to the MOU that established NMA. And so all jurisdictions have amended that with their requirements. Each jurisdiction recognises the other state-based data linkage HRECs, and certainly policies will be updated to align. In New South Wales, that's yet to happen, but we've provided some exemptions in New South Wales to the policy until we can get those updated and aligned. And of course, the MOU is signed off by each of the jurisdictions' health departments, or equivalent, as they were. So the application process that goes about for pretty much all ethics and governance research projects, but particularly with data linkage research, is really about planning and the initial contact, I think, is the first thing. And so we've encouraged researchers to make contact with their relevant data custodians or their data linkage unit to discuss the project requirements. Certainly for cross-jurisdictional studies, we note PHRN has a form which provides a centralised way of coordinating the feedback from all the data linkage units, and provides for one quote to be able to do that. So there's certainly a lot of ease in being able to do that. And data custodians, for when you do that, is just obviously contact them to see if they have the required data. We don't have any particular position on whether you do this before or after getting ethics. I know that some jurisdictions do prefer HREC review first, though obviously it's obviously some parallel processes there in order to work with the data linkage unit, the data custodians, and the ethics committee. So with the ethics, you submit your HREC. I'll go through a bit of that very briefly in a minute, but to one of the specialist data linkage HRECs under NMA. And then for data collections involving just one jurisdiction, we have had the advice, sent out the advice previously that you must go to that jurisdiction's data linkage HREC. That's particularly in New South Wales. I think others are more okay to have to receive ethics from a different jurisdiction. For us, there obviously are some jurisdictional specific requirements. Some jurisdictions require an SSA to approve the use of data, so a site-specific assessment form used in general research. Others, in New South Wales, we have a specified data custodian application form, which is from our central agency data sets, and they have things that need to be ticked off for there if you're going to those jurisdictional data sets. Our advice, I think, rather than anticipate what they might need, is really just to contact those jurisdictional health officers for details there. Of course, in New South Wales, we encourage going through the local data linkage unit. They provide a service where they obtain the data custodian sign-offs and they organise any of the authorisations under law. I think there's probably some usefulness in going to the data linkage units. But as I say, I think if you conduct it as a parallel process too, I think it's more, it's useful to be able to get all of those approvals together. So in terms of the ethics application, I'm just quickly noting the time as we're here. In terms of the NMA, and I think really this is one of the strengths of NMA generally, and I just sort of reiterate some of the comments that Suzanne's made about the collegiate nature of NMA. I go to a number of conferences where I hear bemoaning of the federation and the federal structure that we all have, and why can't we, at various stages, abolish the states, or any other wild ideas that people have. But I think this is actually a great example of jurisdictional agreement. You have the jurisdictions who've come together to say we want to mutually recognise ethics committees in other jurisdictions, but also in doing that, using the Commonwealth developed tools. So the national statement, the HREC, and of course, as Suzanne's mentioned, the NHMRC certification for ethics committees. So this is the HREC. It's the NHMRC developed all-purpose application form for research projects. Of course, apply through the relevant jurisdictional research management system. So ERM in Victoria, Queensland, and Regis in New South Wales, GEMS in South Australia, and RGS in Western Australia. They all use we all use the same form there. Of course, in terms of assessing your project against for ethical conduct, the National Statement on Ethical Review of Human Research, developed by the NHRC, of course, ARC and the ABCC too. Obviously, my picture is a bit out of date. It's been updated in 2018, so since 2015, but nonetheless. So really, what does an ethics committee look for? And again, I just sort of reiterate my earlier point. We don't tell ethics committees at the AMA level what they need to do. They assess a project against the national statement. But really, what needs to be submitted really, it's for most other types of projects, a HREA and a protocol. In New South Wales, there's a health data form, which ensures that you're adhering to the privacy principles. Although it was brought to my attention just recently that it wasn't really a form that we had officially endorsed, and we are looking at just improving it as well. So we may have some amendments to that form, but for the moment, our Population and Health Services Research Committee requires the New South Wales Health Data Privacy Form. But really, in addition to the same sort of scientific aspects for any other human research, ethics committees looking at data linkage are looking at, well, can the waiver of consent be justified? What kind of data are being collected? Where are they stored? What are the variables? Is re-identification possible? Looking at obviously the researchers, their background and ability to conduct the research, statistical analysis plan, and of course, how do you account for the separation principle in data linkage? Of course, the data linkage units are the ones who do much of that work, but these are the things that ethics committees will want to be satisfied of before they, when they're reviewing projects. I would, perhaps finally, I'm not sure all of who the researchers are that I'm talking to, but I think one of the things to really understand about getting through the ethics process is the quality of the applications, and really understanding your research and understanding the application that you want to take forward. And we always hear about it's about getting through the process of ethics approval, and as though it's some sort of Sisyphean task that you can't go forward unless you go through it multiple times. So I think understand that really the onus is on the researcher before they apply is to engage with the ethical issues in their research. So are there conflicts of interest? Certainly consenting for participants. This isn't something that necessarily happens in data linkage research. There's often waiving of consent, but it's about justifying why that is ethically. Similarly with data custodians, understanding what their needs are, and also meet and discuss the requirements with your data linkage unit before your submission. And then you can start to get a better understanding of how to get through the process or engage with the process as best as possible. So, look, that's all I had. So I'll hand back to everyone for the questions, Felicity and Nicola, and we can go from there. So